You are never alone with a newborn. Not for a single hour. Not even for a single minute. That baby in your arms, it has never touched the ground. It has never been put down. It has lived entirely against warm human skin since the moment it was born, and it will keep living that way for months, maybe years. Not because you're anxious, not because you read a parenting book, because this is simply what raising a child looks like for your species, and it has looked this way for a very long time. For roughly 300,000 years, this was the only way. Modern parenting culture tells you there is a right amount of holding, a right amount of independence, a right age to sleep in a separate room, to stop breastfeeding, to let them cry it out. There are entire industries built on the idea that too much closeness makes a soft child, and that teaching a baby to self-soothe at 4 months is wisdom. But if you could step back far enough, if you could look at the full 300,000-year arc of Homo sapiens raising their young, what you would see would look almost nothing like that. And the gap between what your ancestors did and what modern parenting culture recommends is not a small one. It is enormous. Let's start at the very beginning. When your child was born in a hunter-gatherer band, something happened that almost never happens in a hospital today. The baby was passed around. Immediately. Not just to you and your partner, but to aunts, uncles, older children, grandmothers, the elder who helped with the birth. Anthropologist Sarah Hrdy spent decades studying what she called cooperative breeding in humans. The idea that our species evolved not as isolated mother-father pairs raising children, but as a collective. In her landmark 2009 book Mothers and Others, Hrdy argues that humans are unusual among apes precisely because we did not raise children alone. We distributed the labor across a web of trusted caregivers she named alloparents, from the Greek allo, meaning other. Other parents. People who were not the biological mother or father, but who invested in the child's survival as if it were their own. Your grandmother was not just visiting. She was essential. In the Kung San people of the Kalahari Desert, one of the most studied hunter-gatherer groups in the world, anthropologist Melvin Konner documented in extraordinary detail what a childhood actually looked like in a traditional foraging society. His research, spanning decades of field work and compiled in his 2010 book, The Evolution of Childhood, showed that infants in these communities were held or carried for virtually all of their waking hours. Not some of the time. All of it. The infant was pressed against a caregiver's body, usually in a sling or carrier against the mother's hip or back, while that caregiver worked, walked, foraged, talked, and slept. The baby moved with the group. It heard every conversation, felt every heartbeat, smelled every fire, and was never placed in a separate room to sleep alone. That last part matters more than it might seem. Cosleeping, sharing a sleep surface with your child, is something that parenting advice in Western countries has spent decades trying to eliminate, framing it as dangerous or as a habit that creates dependent, poorly sleeping children. But across the vast majority of human cultures, both historical and contemporary, children have always slept next to a caregiver. Always. Konner's fieldwork showed that among the Kung, children co-sleep with their mothers until a new sibling is born, often until age 3 or 4. James McKenna, a biological anthropologist and sleep researcher at the University of Notre Dame, has spent over 30 years studying infant and mother sleep together. His lab found that when mothers and infants sleep in close proximity, they synchronize their breathing patterns, their arousals from sleep, and their sleep stages in ways that appear to reduce the risk of certain breathing irregularities in newborns. The idea that sleeping next to your child is inherently dangerous is, in a long view of human history, a very recent and very specific cultural invention. It is not a universal truth. Now, let's think about what a child's day actually looked like. Imagine you are a child in a band of 30 people somewhere on the African savanna, roughly 50,000 years ago. You wake up next to your mother. The fire from the night before is still faintly glowing at the center of camp. Before long, the adults are moving, talking, deciding what the day will bring. You're 3 years old. You have no structured schedule, no lessons planned, no activities organized for your benefit. And yet you are never bored, because you are surrounded by people of every age, and you are expected to simply be present in the flow of adult life. Anthropologists call this free play in mixed age groups, and it looks radically different from the age-sorted, adult-supervised play that fills a modern child's day. Older children teach younger ones. You learn to use a tool not because someone sits you down and instructs you, but because you watch for years, then imitate, then gradually take over. The child who is 5 watches the child who is 9. The child who is 9 watches the adult. There is no division between learning and living. They're the same thing. Wiessner, an anthropologist who has worked extensively with the Kung San and other forager groups, found that a huge proportion of adult life in these communities happened around the campfire at night. Storytelling, conflict resolution, laughter, the passing of knowledge through narrative. Children were present for all of it. There was no bedtime that banished them to another room. They fell asleep listening to adults talk, and they absorbed that cultural content the way children absorb language, passively, constantly, without formal instruction. Your ancestors did not teach children. They let children watch everything. And what about discipline? This is perhaps the sharpest contrast with many modern parenting models. Researcher Peter Gray, a developmental psychologist at Boston College, has studied hunter-gatherer childhood specifically through the lens of play and autonomy. What he found, documented across dozens of forager societies, was a striking consistency. Hunter-gatherer children were almost never physically punished, almost never given direct commands by adults, and almost never told what to do with their time. The child's autonomy was treated as essentially sacred. Adults intervened in genuine danger, but the idea of an adult commanding a child to sit still, be quiet, stop doing that, come here now, this kind of directive parenting appears to have been genuinely rare. This is not because hunter-gatherer children were better behaved by nature. It is because the social structure made it unnecessary. A child growing up inside a tight-knit band of 30 people, cosleeping with caregivers, carried constantly in infancy, surrounded by alloparents, embedded in unstructured mixed-age play. That child was not struggling against isolation or understimulation. The misbehavior that modern parenting works so hard to manage is, in many cases, a response to conditions your ancestors never experienced. The defiance, the tantrums, the constant bids for attention. Your ancestors' children had those needs met before they became crises. Now here is where it gets genuinely strange. In many forager societies, the notion that a child belongs primarily to its biological parents is not the dominant framework at all. Hrdy's research showed that in some communities, an infant might be nursed by multiple women, carried and soothed by a rotating cast of alloparents, and treated as a kind of collective responsibility that the whole band shared. This is not neglect. The opposite is true. The child was so embedded in a social web that its survival was distributed, ensured across many people rather than resting on two. The nuclear family, mother, father, child, separate home, is a very new experiment in human social organization. It is a product of agriculture, urbanization, industrialization. It would have looked bizarre and somewhat frightening to your hunting and gathering ancestors. Raising a child in a house where only 2 adults are responsible for everything, where no extended family is present, where a mother might spend entire days alone with a baby and no other adult. That scenario would have struck them not as independence, but as a kind of social poverty. And modern data is starting to say something similar. Rates of postpartum depression, parental burnout, and childhood anxiety are consistently higher in societies with weaker extended family networks and lower community involvement. The isolation that modern parents feel, and that modern children feel, is not a personal failure. It is a structural mismatch between a social species and the conditions it is currently living in. Your body was not built to raise a child alone. Neither was your child's brain built to develop in isolation from a web of caregivers, mixed-age peers, and the continuous background noise of communal life. So when you're exhausted, when the parenting books feel like they're describing a different species, when nothing works the way it is supposed to, consider that you might not be failing at parenting. You might simply be attempting to do something that evolution never intended any single person to do. You wake up next to your child. They are warm. They are breathing. Somewhere nearby, Someone else who loves them is also awake. In the long arc of your species, this was not the exception. This was the whole point.